Okay, so we're going to get started. And again, welcome to Taking a Systems Approach to Advancing Digital Equity for All. We're really thrilled to have you joining us today. And again, if you're just entering the room, put your name, your organization, and where you're joining us from. My name is Chloe Sanducci, and I'm the project manager for Project Unicorn. And I'm very excited to start this webinar off today. So today we are going to do some quick welcome and introductions, and then we are going to be talking about the Advancing Digital Equity for All resource, specifically getting into the availability, the affordability, and the adoption, and how districts and state leaders can leverage this resource. That will then follow by a Q&A and thank you and next steps. But before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit more about Project Unicorn. So Project Unicorn is a national initiative coordinated by Innovate EDU and powered by a coalition of organizations that represent stakeholders across the education sector and is focused on the goal of optimizing and radically improving data and interoperability within K-12 education. For our districts, we really encourage you to sign our Project Unicorn Pledge, which signals to other school networks, EdTech tools, and your school community that you're committed to helping your students grow with interoperability. You can follow the link that's being put into the chat, and it's also in this slide deck that will be sent out to you to learn more and to sign the pledge. And in just a moment, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful speakers today. But as we move through this webinar, please add any and all questions that you have into the Q&A section of the webinar room. You'll see a little button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Just click that button and type in your question, and we'll answer it at the end of today. So I'm very excited to pass it over to our wonderful speakers. We have Susan Bearden here, the Director of Digital Programs from Innovate EDU and Project Unicorn. And we also have Ji-Soo Song, Digital Equity Advisor from the U.S. Department of Education. And I'm going to pass it over to Ji-Soo.
All right. Well, thank you to Project Unicorn and everyone here for inviting me to this webinar. My name is Ji-Soo Song, as Chloe mentioned, and I serve as a digital equity advisor here in the Office of EdTech, where my role is to collaborate with agencies across the federal government to help maximize the impact of programs and policies around broadband access and digital equity for our students. And if you're unfamiliar with OET, the Office of EdTech's mission is to establish that national vision for how technology can be used to transform teaching and learning and enable everywhere, all the time learning. And we achieve this in a variety of ways, from guidance and policy development to strategic investments and coalition building. And you may have heard of us through our flagship policy document, which is the National EdTech Plan, which we are working to refresh right now. And last fall, our office launched our Digital Equity Education Roundtables initiative, or the DEAR initiative, which aimed to suggest strategies for leaders as they begin developing digital equity plans with funds from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And we hope that this presentation today will help you think about your roles as education leaders in the development of state digital equity plans. So I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But for some background, we all know that the pandemic highlighted the impact of the digital divide on learners lacking home access, right? We see from the research that students who lack access to this fundamental resource, exhibit lower digital skills attainment, homework completion rates, GPAs, standardized test scores, and it has implications for their post-secondary success, college readiness, workforce readiness, right? And as we continue recovering from the pandemic, we know that educators are coming out from the last 3 years with the breadth of active and innovative learning opportunities that are made possible through technology. And we also see schools implementing, more whole learner approaches that are unlocked through technology as well, right? Like social emotional learning, connections to telehealth, telemental health opportunities, wraparound services, right? And we have an opportunity through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that the president signed into law last November for these opportunities to become more equitably and sustainably available at scale. And within the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is the Digital Equity Act, which is administered through our great colleagues at the Department of Commerce and NTIA, which funds the development and implementation of state digital equity plans. So with all of this policy background in mind, the central questions that we've asked ourselves here at the department were, we're not the lead agencies, obviously, on the Digital Equity Act, right? So as a supporting agency, what is the Department of Education's role in maximizing the impact of that $65 billion broadband package in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, especially as state leaders create plans for spending these dollars? And as we carry out this support role, how do we make sure that we're increasing access for learners, families, educators, and communities that are furthest from digital opportunities? And all these questions were what led to development of our DEAR initiative. And through this DEAR, this banner, OET held a series of national conversations this year with communities and organizations that are championing education and digital access, including families and students themselves. And we used the findings from all of these conversations to develop guidance for leaders as they develop state digital equity plans. And I'll go over some highlights from that guidance with you today. And we're continuing to spur action and commitment among different sectors in the digital equity ecosystem. We had some strategic conversations with various key players that we know need to get involved in the solutions development, including our ed nonprofits, state and district leaders, philanthropies. I just had a conversation with the White House in a small virtual convening with EdTech leaders yesterday, think tanks, research organizations, etc. And in developing that guidance resource that I talked about, we made sure to place our learners at the center. We intentionally designed our initiative to hear directly from those that are representing populations that we know from the data, that we know from the stories that are currently furthest from digital equity and opportunity. So we had some listening sessions focused on our learners of color, those from rural communities, those in digitally redlined urban communities, our Native and Indigenous learners, low-income post-secondary adult learners. We also included learners that we don't often think about when it comes to this issue of digital equity, including our highly mobile populations, those experiencing homelessness, those that interact with the justice system, learners with disabilities, and our parent and caregiver populations, of course. And at the National Digital Equity Summit that the U.S. Department of Education hosted back in September, we launched that guidance publication that was informed by these learner-centered listening sessions, Advancing Digital Equity for All. And we're excited to be able to share this resource with you all today. And the resource is now available on tech.ed.gov/DEAR. And you can also scan the QR code on this slide to access the resource. I'm going to move on, but you'll get the QR code again. I'll come back to this slide at the very end. All right. So we found through our scan of the literature on digital equity and through our listening sessions that access can be described in three sort of A's, right? Availability, affordability, and adoption. And this framework is what drives the new guidance resource. And for equitable access to happen, we need to make sure that we're addressing all three aspects in parallel. Availability, pointing to that physical infrastructure. You can think of them as the boxes and wires piece, right? The fiber networks underground, the cell towers that need to go up to ensure physical availability of broadband. Affordability, the family's ability to pay for the total cost of maintaining that access. And then adoption, even when we solve for the availability and affordability challenges, we still need to think about the human level barriers that often impede access in some of our communities, like access to information, technical support, digital skills, digital literacy, digital resilience, etc. So I'll go over some highlights from each of these sections, but please refer to the full guidance for a more full detailed description, as well as case studies that illustrate how the barriers and strategies play out in different communities. And in the guidance and this presentation also, you'll find that we intentionally give the most attention to the issue of adoption. Our federal colleagues at the FCC and NTIA are obviously tackling issues of broadband availability and affordability. And we really saw the Department of Education's role in driving home that fact. We can't just tackle these two issues and say mission accomplished, right? That adoption piece has to be there to make sure that the resources actually reach our end users. So I do want to begin with the availability section. This is the definition that's included in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And the barriers, we know that many students of color, students from low-income families, and students in rural areas lack service from home that's of sufficient speed and bandwidth to support learning from home. And this is compounded by a variety of other barriers, such as lack of reliable ownership to a personal device from home, years of digital redlining practices, right, which has resulted in areas of low infrastructure investment in many urban areas as well as rural areas. building level barriers that limit installation of certain services, which is often seen in communities where families might reside in older multi-tenant living situations. And through our conversation, we got to learn about a little bit of availability strategies as well. These included more temporary measures that we've seen in the last 3 years, like take-home hotspots and devices with distribution efforts that were led by schools, institutions, libraries, and other community anchor organizations. But other communities were looking at more sustainable solutions like outfitting public spaces like community centers and their libraries with solutions for connectivity, as well as partnering with ISPs to focus those infrastructure investments in historically underserved areas. And the next piece is affordability. And this is the definition that we use in our guidance. And affordability barriers might include, high cost of broadband and technology tools for learning, which obviously for some families and learners can compete with basic needs like food, gas, shelter, electricity, and lack of sustained funding for locally administered affordable internet programs. And some of the strategies that were promising that our listening session participants talked about were the Affordable Connectivity Program, right? A big priority of the Biden-Harris administration right now is to help qualifying households enroll in the Affordable Connectivity Program, or the ACP, which you may already know provides a discount of $30 a month for internet bills for qualifying families and $75 per month for those in tribal lands. And you can find guidance on how to support students and families in enrolling for the ACP at tech.ed.gov/ACP. I see the link already in the chat, so thank you for that. We've also seen some ISPs additionally committing to offer ACP eligible families at least one high-speed internet plan for $30 per month or less with no additional fees or no data caps. And this would mean that if households apply their ACP benefit to one of these plans, they would have no out-of-pocket cost for internet. And you can find more information on that at tech.ed.gov/ACP, but also getinternet.gov. So I briefly skimmed through the availability and affordability section, but I do want to spend the majority of our time on this issue of adoption. And this is the definition that we use in our guidance. Again, this is an often overlooked issue, and we have to make strategic investments into adoption solutions if we are to move the needle on digital equity in an equitable manner. So some of the barriers that our national conversation participants talked about: exclusion of impacted communities from the decision-making process, right? As we develop our strategies, as we develop these state digital equity plans, when the voices of the folks that are impacted by the digital divide are left out of the planning efforts, there can be a disconnect between the solutions and what the communities actually need. And this can tie into the issue of trust, right? There's often a distrust of systems and programs between communities and the government or private entities that provide these services. And communities who experience marginalization often don't trust federal and state governments and private companies due to historical and ongoing exclusionary practices. Lack of intentional collaboration is another thing that ties into all of this. Without partnerships across sectors, especially between the broadband sector and the education sector, limited knowledge, limited expertise, lack of relationships can prevent even the most well-intentioned efforts from seeing impact. Lack of reliable disaggregated data, right? We often see overly aggregated data that results in inaccurate understanding of access to broadband and technology tools. And when we use these overly aggregated data to drive funding and program decisions, it can actually widen the digital divide for a lot of communities. Lack of inclusive strategies for communications. When we don't provide communications about services, resources in the community's home languages or in accessible formats, public awareness of those services and resources don't increase as much as we'd like to. Think about the ACP that I mentioned in the last slide, right? If we aren't communicating about that in accessible format, in inclusive formats, we're only communicating that to a small subset of our learners and families. Lack of access to critical support resources, right? Learners and families might need assistance to complete applications for affordable broadband programs and other, support services like digital literacy workshops, and to fully understand all of the program's different scopes. So that was all of the barriers. So what about the strategies that our, listening session participants talked about when it comes to adoption? Co-creating solutions is going to be really important. Collaborating with those who experience the digital divide firsthand is going to be integral, not only to hear about those current pressing needs, but also to build trust. I mentioned that trust is a big barrier, right? And buy-in from the community members as the strategies are deployed. Providing multilingual and multimodal technical support, right? During the pandemic, we see communities establish hotlines, recruit digital navigators, right? These digital navigators, as trusted members of the community, can collect information on the barriers that are faced by the community, support families and caregivers in signing up for programs like the ACP, and provide digital skills training and one-to-one technical support. Building digital literacy and resilience for communities. It's not enough that we distribute the necessary physical tools, right? We have to offer opportunities for learners, families, caregivers, and community members to develop these skills to use the technology to meet their goals. And this has to be sustainable. Leveraging trusted community assets, education institutions, community anchor institutions, and community-based organizations have facilitated information exchange and resource distribution as trusted hubs, especially over the last 3 years. And they have also been key players in providing digital literacy training opportunities for learners and their families. And they often have the expertise to ensure that communications methods are inclusive, like providing translations in different languages and accessibility accommodations, right? And finally, regular learning and feedback cycles. As adoption strategies are implemented, it's going to be really important to ensure that learners and other community members have an opportunity to openly provide feedback on what's working and has to be scaled, or what's not working and needs a little bit of adjustment. And I want to emphasize that all these strategies, while communities have seen success with these strategies, they require sustained funding and capacity building to maintain these gains that we've seen in the last 3 years and close the digital divide going forward. Now, that was a lot of information, and we recognize that this work is going to be hard. And individual sectors, individual communities are not going to be able to do this alone. And although we know our education leaders and our educators have been critical drivers of digital equity in the last 3 years, partnerships and cross-sector collaborations are going to be imperative to ensure that that responsibility doesn't just fall on them going forward. So in the conclusion to our guidance resource, we call on leaders from various sectors collaborate with community members to co-create solutions that accelerate progress towards digital equity, right? And we use the 3 C's to guide our recommendations for these various sectors. Communicate. We have to leverage targeted, inclusive, and accessible communications methods to raise awareness and understanding of policies and programs that support learners. Think about those communications channels for the ACP. Collaborating, partnering with those impacted by inequitable access and also across sectors to work towards our shared vision for digital equity, and catalyze, accelerating the progress towards digital equity by leveraging data to identify barriers and building on the unique roles that each sector can contribute in meeting diverse needs of our learners and families. So just to close out on the presentation, we seen some progress, of course, on digital equity in recent years, but further efforts are going to be necessary to ensure that learners of all backgrounds, locations, identities, experiences have access to reliable, high-speed broadband and technology tools for learning. And the state digital equity plans are going to be a key policy lever in helping us move forward. Our roundtable participants, shared out solutions included in these digital equity plans need to be sustainable and community-driven, continuously involving those who experience the digital divide. So obviously, this means that efforts to build state digital equity plans have to start with a strong plan for meaningful community and ecosystem engagement. So the barriers and strategies that I talked about earlier in the earlier slides can be a really good starting point to ground these collaborative efforts in. As we take this work into the next phase at the Office of EdTech, we're going to be cultivating and connecting digital equity champions for all learners by amplifying these community-based recommendations by attending webinars and events like this, uplifting local case stories and examples to spur action and commitment, and supporting strategic implementation and development of state digital equity plans. So that was a little bit from me. Thank you for listening in on this presentation. The link is here on the slide again if you need it to the full guidance, and the QR code as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Jisoo. We really appreciate it. So hello, everyone. I'm Susan Bearden again, the Director of Digital Programs for Innovate EDU, and I'm here to ask Jisoo some questions. So please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A section, which you'll find the button at the bottom of your screen. And we already have one from Steve. The question, Jisoo, is, is there a place to go to find out if and how adoption is being funded or supported in state broadband plans?
This is a really great question. It's good because the Digital Equity Act does call for digital inclusion solutions, which can include these adoption strategies, right? So it is an allowable, expense from these programs. And we're sort of early on in the game, right? States are going to be developing these state digital equity plans over the next year. So the time is really now to ensure that, of course, we need to be, building out the physical infrastructure and investing in affordability solutions. But the time is really now to ensure that all states, are considering and investing in these adoption strategies that our, roundtable and national conversation participants who experience the digital divide felt would be important. So I certainly hope that your question, becomes true, that they do consider these adoption solutions and fund them using the federal dollars from the Biden administration.
Great. Thanks, Jisoo. And thank you, Steve, for asking the question. So Jisoo, how do you recommend state and district leaders use this guide?
Really great question. So I know that folks on this call, as well as our LEA partners, SEA partners, have seen the impact of the digital divide firsthand in the last 3 years. So all of those leaders' voices will be really critical to developing effective digital equity plans. So as I mentioned, we need to start mobilizing now to build a bridge between the education sector and the broadband sector, right? Because the broadband sector, they might not be aware of the barriers that our students face on a daily basis. So I encourage folks to find out who the lead agency at your state is that's going to be developing these digital equity plans. And the Broadband USA website from NTIA can be a really good resource to find out if my state has a digital equity office or a state broadband office. And I encourage you to engage those leaders. The guidance resource that OET released and we talked about today can provide some starters for, key items that you can discuss with them, right? For example, how do the barriers and strategies resonate for your own communities within your own states? And could they guide some of the key investments and items in the digital equity plans? One thing that we're actively encouraging SEAs to think about, especially, is to offering to convene a roundtable conversation opportunity, allowing state broadband leaders to meet with LEAs, to meet with school leaders, to meet with parents, to meet with students, and come together and achieve consensus around the needs of the education sector and the assets that it can provide during the digital equity planning and implementation. And obviously, OET would be happy to be part of those conversations if our presidents would help. I've had a chance to talk with many states over the last couple of months, and some states, are really using this opportunity to build that bridge between the education sector and the broadband sector. This type of engagement is already happening, and that's awesome, right? But there are some other folks where, the education groups didn't know that this was an opportunity to advocate. So the time really is now for us to mobilize and say, we know that these are the barriers that our learners face, and this is the opportunity to invest in the strategies that will get around those barriers that we've seen, especially in the last 3 years.
Excellent. Jisoo, another thought, one thing that I'm aware of is that different communities have different digital equity challenges. How does the department recommend that state and districts leaders go about identifying the specific digital equity challenges in their specific communities?
Yeah, and this was actually a question that we asked ourselves during the guidance development. So the guidance concludes with 5 steps for leaders as they are developing these digital equity plans, which are derived directly from the barriers and strategies that I described earlier. First, we need to be developing and earning public trust through authentic engagement and collaboration with community partners, right? Those community-based organizations, community anchor institutions that our learners and families continuously seek out. Learning from these impacted and learning from those impacted by inequitable access and providing accessible opportunities for feedback. Number 3, co-developing clear goals with them and strategies with them, with communities to craft comprehensive digital equity plans. Raising public awareness through inclusive communications to provide ongoing support for low-cost or no-cost broadband programs. and providing digital literacy training and professional learning opportunities for educators, learners, families, and communities. We emphasize that this work will require collaboration among leaders and communities to co-develop and implement strategies that are aligned to their unique circumstances and address all three components of access: availability, affordability, and adoption. So I really encourage folks to find out more by reading the conclusion of our guidance resource.
Excellent. And Steve has another question in the chat, another great question. What is the role of after-school summer learning and community-based youth programming in increasing digital?
Yeah, I've had a chance to visit, some of these community-based partners that are really doing some active work in this space, right? If the folks are lacking access to, reliable high-speed internet from home, these can be really great, convening locations for folks to get access to high-speed, reliable broadband as the physical infrastructure is being built out, right? But we see, folks going a step above that, not just providing, device access and internet access, but leveraging the staff there and the leadership there to provide digital literacy training for, parents, so that, when students do go home, parents know how to support their learning using the digital tools, right? And providing, technical support. Obviously, I do need it sometimes, you're going to run into problems with your computer, with your router, with whatever, right? And they're leveraging the staff there, partner organizations there, to make sure that families can go to someone physically and say, this is what I'm having problems with. So all of these programs can be a really great way to not only provide that physical access to the internet, but also, build the capacity of our communities and families, right? But that also means that they need funding, they need some capacity, right? And the state digital equity plans can be a really great way to emphasize that these can be really critical partners. Yeah.
That's a great point. I was also thinking how those institutions have really strong relationships within the community that can address some of the challenges that you were talking about with regard to adoption in terms of the trust that's been built up. If there's a lack of trust in sort of the state and government organizations, there may be more trust in the community-based organization that can help move the work forward.
Absolutely. Yep.
Another thing the guide does is cite several examples of digital equity best practices from schools, colleges, community organizations, and state and local governments. How can readers learn more about these initiatives?
Yeah, during the summit that we did back in September, we actually had a panel featuring many of these local leaders, and we got a ton of positive feedback saying that this particular session within the overall programming was a hit because it featured perspectives and solutions from diverse populations. So if you missed that, you can catch the recording of the live stream at edstream.ed.gov. I'll put the link in the chat in just a bit. We also published a new blog post with highlights from the summit so that you can read about these best practices, and I'll put that link in the chat right now. At the summit, we also conducted a series of video interviews with additional leaders that are discussing their solutions, and we're working to release those videos. And the first one that's featuring a district superintendent from Ohio should be on our YouTube and on tech.ed.gov/stories. So I'll put that link in the chat. And we're working to develop some additional stories of community-led efforts that are seeking to close the adoption gap, so we can provide state leaders with ideas about the types of solutions that they can invest into. We know that, some state broadband offices, some state digital equity offices are pretty new to the game. So we're trying to provide them with ideas and spark inspirations for, what's promising out there. So please be on the lookout regularly on tech.ed.gov/stories for new stories that we'll be putting out on a regular basis over the next year or so.
Excellent. Well, this is already a fabulous resource and great contribution to the field, this guide. But I'm wondering what additional resources either are offered by the department to support digital equity or will be coming in the future besides the stories that you mentioned and the guide itself.
Yeah, I mentioned a little bit about the Affordable Connectivity Program. It's not offered from the Department of Education directly, but, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law created this program to lower, internet costs for families. Eligible households can, get up to $30 a month off your internet bills, or if they're on tribal land, $75 a month, and a one-time $100 discount off of a device. fall of last year, we actually had a chance to convene a listening session for the FCC where, the stakeholders that we focused on noted large gaps in the awareness of programs like the ACP. So I'm glad that the FCC is really doubling down on the awareness campaign behind the program and recently announced even an outreach grant that you all can apply for. And we've heard from many different groups that schools often serve as hubs of trusted information for many communities when it comes to broadband, and that role was obviously accelerated by the pandemic. So to help, with the help of our colleagues at the FCC, USDA, we recently updated our ACP page with tools to help schools in their outreach, and that link is already in the chat, tech.ed.gov/ACP for that toolkit. And we've also engaged in a back to school campaign to raise further awareness for the program. We collaborated with the Deputy Secretary and the FCC to do a series of site visits in North Carolina recently that was adjacent to Secretary Cardona's back to school tour to highlight some community-led efforts that are increasing enrollment in the ACP. And we're in constant communication with the White House right now to continue raising the profile of the ACP through targeted briefings and other strategic outreach efforts. And one other resource that I want to mention that I sort of mentioned in the intro is the NETP, right? We have our efforts to develop and refresh the National EdTech Plan, which again is our flagship policy document that sets that national vision for effective EdTech use. And the project team crafting this will be putting together a series of listening sessions starting in January to ensure that the plan is informed by experts on the ground. And we anticipate that the headline issues that are tackled in the NETP will be the digital divide, which we're talking about today, the digital design divide. How do we make sure that we're designing learning experiences with universal design for learning and accessibility and learner variability in mind, and also the digital use divide, right? Making sure that we're moving away from passive uses of technology to the more active uses. So please be on the lookout for the NETP refresh and the steps that you all can take to contribute to that national vision.
Excellent. And I think we may have touched on this in an earlier question, but I just wanted to confirm, since we were just talking earlier about the importance of building relationships with community organizations to help support digital equity. Are there any additional federal resources or funding streams available to help state and district leaders facilitate these kinds of collaborative efforts?
Right. So first and foremost, I think funds from the American Rescue Plan come to mind, right? We hope that state and local leaders see the importance and impact of these investments and continue to prioritize that funding going forward. But for federal investments that we're making right now, the Office of EdTech is revising our Dear Colleague letter, which clarifies the various funding levers from other offices within the Department of Education that can serve many of the functions that we discussed today. And we also worked with our interagency broadband working group, the American Broadband Initiative, to publish a new federal funding guide, which lays out different funding sources and from various agencies, even outside of the Department of Education. And it also clarifies the distinct uses that each is intended to serve, and that can be found on Broadband USA. And I'll try to put the link in the chat. I think I have it handy, so.
Excellent. Yes, the folks at Broadband USA are doing some really terrific work in this area. Thanks for sharing that information. Excellent. Well, I don't see any additional questions in the chat, but certainly, GC, you have been just an amazing source of incredibly valuable information, and the links that you shared in the chat are terrific. We will make sure that we take these links, and when we send out an email for follow-up after the webinar to attendees and folks who registered, we'll be sure to include those. And now I'm going to turn things back over to my colleague Chloe to wrap things up. Chloe, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Susan. And to close out today, before we end, there's a couple things that we want to note. So please join Project Unicorn for our next webinar. It's on Tuesday, December 6th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. This is in collaboration with SIIA, and it's called Interoperability for EdTech Vendors 101. And you can register in this slide deck, as well as it will be put into the chat. And also check out our Project Unicorn YouTube channel. You can get all of the recordings from this webinar and share them. This webinar will be on there and any past webinars, as well as future ones after they occur. And we want to say thank you for everyone who joined us today. It was a real pleasure to have you here, and we hope that you enjoyed this discussion. And everyone here will receive a link to this webinar after this call, so you can watch it again and share it out with your networks. Make sure to stay tuned for any additional future webinars with Project Unicorn, including our one that will again be on December 6th. And thank you again to our extraordinary partners. And thank you for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.